Morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event today. This webinar is about when operational resilience and consumer duty, I would say, intersect and also collide. Two major pieces of regulation that we thought with Andrew and Jimmy we will explore in a little bit more details. This webinar and what we're going to discuss today is about a white paper we co-authored with Andrew and Jimmy. If you have not downloaded the webinar, the white paper yet, I will invite you to do so on my website, and you're going to find a link in a minute. We thought we will go back to those two major pieces of regulation, operational resilience and consumer duty. You're also going to see, actually, we're going to talk a little bit about SMCR, because we couldn't talk about these two pieces of regulation without coming back to SMCR. And we will be focusing on those aspects where there is overlap between those regulations and what to do when they collide or conflict. It's my pleasure to welcome Jimmy and Andrew today. Andrew, shall I start with you? Do you want to introduce yourself briefly to the crowd?
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, I'd just like to give my personal thanks to everyone for joining. Those of you who know me will know how terrified of technology I am, and this is very much our first time using this platform, so please bear with us. If you don't know me, I spent 10 years at the UK regulator, first the Financial Services Authority, and then I was one of the people that moved into the Prudential Regulation Authority. I was always on the operational risk side, and for the second half of my career in the regulator, I was running the team of operational risk and governance experts that went in to visit firms. Since then, I spent a couple of years at HSBC and some time at Credit Suisse, both in the second line. And I retired. I wasn't very good at being retired. And so now I have a consultancy and I'm working with people wherever I can, including Jimmy and Julien. So over to you, Jimmy.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Julien. So my name's Jimmy Hinchliffe. Similar to Andrew, I started life at the older UK regulator, the FSA, initially in the operational risk policy space. And then I did banker supervision for about 4 years and then moved full circle to head up the Basel II implementation side there. Spent almost a decade at the regulator, similar to Andrew. Then moved to work at MUFG, the biggest Japanese bank, heading up a department there called Policy Risk and Regulatory Affairs. Spent about 8 years there. And then for the last 8 years, I've been doing consulting, mainly in the operational risk, operational resilience, particularly in the last few years. And I guess mainly helping firms deal with new regulations, including, of course, consumer duty, which we'll talk about today. And particularly for the last few years, been working very closely with Andrew. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both, and a little bit of background by myself. So Julien Haye, I spent almost 24 years in the financial services industry, of late as Chief Risk Officer and Global Head of Non-Financial Risk for an asset manager. I worked in investment banking, albeit my background is actually not risk management. I started on the front office and I worked in finance and more. And I created and set up my own consultancy firm last year. So I became independent last year. A little bit of ground rules for this event. The event is about now 55 minutes left. We are going to cover the core aspect, as I mentioned, that we wrote about in the white paper, when operational resilience and consumer duty collide. Please feel free to ask questions. As I mentioned, I will be monitoring the comment box on the live stream on LinkedIn, and I will try to pick up the question as they come. On the back of this event, you'll be able to, firstly, you can already upload the white paper, and you can see the link here, and you can also find it in the email I sent around over the past couple of days. You will have access, hopefully, to this webinar as well, if the recording works properly. That, as Andrew mentioned, it's the first time we're using that platform, so I'll discover at the end whether it worked. And finally, the presentation pack, you're going to have it, but it's pretty much what you will find in the white paper. The final aspect is that at the end, if there is an interest to raise or to transform these webinars into CPD certified webinars, so if there is an interest, please notify me and I'll be happy to look into that. Today, we are going to cover 6, and if we have time, 7 aspects. One, I would give you a quick introduction to the white paper itself, focusing on a couple of aspects. Then Andrew will open a discussion on diverging customer harm definitions. Then we're going to move into a prioritization of services and handling of customer complaints. The approach to end-to-end organizational and product design, which is critical for both regulations. Then we are going to touch on a connection back to SMCR, as I mentioned, because you can't look into this regulation without looking into that connection. We are going also to talk a little bit about holistic risk management. And finally, if we have time and if there are any interest, we're happy to go back to what happened last week with CrowdStrike and Windows. But we'll only cover that if we have time today. So 4 areas of overlap I'd like to mention to frame the discussion today. Again, you can find that in the white paper. One is around customer impact assessment and a touch point between your organizational design processing and the way you set up your product and services for your customer and consumers. Communication and transparency, especially in the context of crisis, and clearly what happened last week and still happening is a good example of that. The way you manage risk, and we're going to come back to that, is critical, and making sure you look at it holistically. And finally, reporting and regulatory notifications, which can become a little bit tricky if you start looking into the three regulations together. Pain points. Jimmy, can you put yourself on mute? I think you're tapping. So 5 pain points that we're going to cover during that discussion. One is around definition of customer harm, and Andrew will cover that. Service prioritization and exclusion considerations are 2 connected topics. Under operational resilience, organization might be tempted to prioritize certain service over others from a resilience perspective, if not to say to exit them together. The problem you might face is that might create some issues and conflict under consumer duty, because you might withdraw some critical services for certain vulnerable customers. Speed of service restoration in context of a crisis, and again, last week was a good example of that, NEC not reporting. So hopefully those aspects frame the discussion for today, and we are going to come back to some of those points as we talk about, and I will invite you to ask questions as we go along. With that, I will hand over to Andrew, who is going to walk us through a few slides and talk about the definition of consumer duty.
Thanks very much, Julien. I'm going to open with a slide which, if you've had any dealings with Manoj and Risk Spotlight on operational resilience, you'll be familiar with this slide. It's certainly a slide we use in our training. And what is being depicted here, and it's probably best to think of it in terms of duration, is what happens if you as an organization experience a disruption. And so the left-hand red line is the disruption takes place. And under operational resilience, you need to set your impact tolerances at the position at which people would be caused intolerable harm if you exceeded your impact tolerance. And as you all know, intolerable harm is something from which the firm and its customers cannot easily recover. It's not something you can compensate your customers for in any way and expect to put them back into their starting position. You'll see there we've also added risk appetite. We've added recovery time objective. Those 2 can move along the line, and we've certainly dealt with firms whose recovery time objective was outside of their risk appetite. So let's not get too caught up on that. So we have this position where if you look along the bottom line, you have inconvenience, inconvenience turns into harm, harm turns into intolerable harm. And for an operational risk, from an operational risk perspective, you have to set your impact tolerances at the position where intolerable harm becomes an issue. Now, if we go on to the next slide, all we're trying to do here is just demonstrate that there are potential overlaps between operational resilience and consumer duty. And I've tried to identify some of these on the next slide, and they're based on the consumer duty requirements. So what firms need to do, and this is where I first began to start thinking about this, is think about what a disruption to any of your important business services would it impact your retail customers? Would it affect your ability to conduct business with them to the appropriate standard? Would it affect your ability to act in good faith? What about your ability to enable and support customers? And this issue about communicating and engaging, I think, is key to this overlap, because if you look at the cross-cutting rules, it's acting in good faith, it's enabling and supporting retail customers. So that's most likely to happen in terms of a disruption in that communication piece. But what about the quality of post-sales support? Say I'm looking for post-sales support and the disruption means I can't communicate with anyone. Are you causing me foreseeable harm? What about your ability to answer questions from a prospective customer? The ability of a prospective customer to apply for a new product? And what about vulnerable customers? So these are all areas where your disruption could have a potential impact on consumer duty. And what we try to do on the next slide is to impose on that original slide you saw a marker for foreseeable harm. Now, foreseeable harm is defined as a harmful result that a reasonable firm could have predicted or expected from their actions or omissions. And so foreseeable harm, quite clearly, if you're thinking in duration, you reach foreseeable harm before you reach intolerable harm. And one of the interesting things is, of course, that UK firms are investing to ensure that they don't breach their impact tolerances after the 31st of March 2025 deadline. But that investment may simply take them to a place where if they have a disruption and it's going to impact consumer duty, although they're not causing intolerable harm, they may be causing foreseeable harm. And that's, for me, one of the key issues with this. Now, if we go on to the next slide, there's a couple of things here to bear in mind as we think about this. The first is, if you decide to invest, then the more aggressive you become in terms of where you're trying to be, the more expensive the investment is likely to be. So, you know, an investment that enables you, if your deadline's T+2, an investment that enables you to move to T+1 is going to be more expensive than an investment that enables you to move to T+1.5. So if you need to invest to avoid foreseeable harm, then that's going to incur an additional cost that, in addition to the operational resilience investment that you have going on. But of course, one of the key things here is it's always easier to be more prudent than less prudent. So if you're moving to the left of the impact tolerance, then you're being more prudent, and I'm sure your board and the regulator will welcome that. The board may not welcome the cost. And so I've been thinking about this, and I think that if you identify the areas where a disruption will impact your consumer duty and the regulator's consumer duty expectations, what you might have to do is establish what I've called a tolerance for disruption and measure towards that. And that's the key issue. So the overlap is causing an issue between impact tolerance and foreseeable harm. And as an organization, you need to be aware that while you might be preparing to ensure customers don't experience intolerable harm, in doing so, you may expose them to foreseeable harm when you're planning your investments. So hopefully that's got that issue across, and I'll pass over to Jimmy, I think.
Yeah, Jimmy, do you have anything else to add to that particular point?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we'll expand on it in the next section. I think the crux of it is just recognizing that there is that tension. And I think that hasn't necessarily been widely recognized within the industry. We almost, it's a classic case where you have these two big examples of new regulatory initiatives being managed often by different people sitting in different silos. And people often haven't really connected them and looked at how they intersect and how the relationship is between them and how that needs to be managed. So maybe if I carry on and talk a bit about that there here. So obviously recognizing and managing that tension is going to be key, and recognizing, as with maybe most all decisions, that there is this trade-off that needs to be considered and managed. A couple of examples, kind of quite hot topic examples, where I think they do potentially collide, potentially where there is that tension. The first one is around the branch closures. So we've seen this, it's been going on for quite a while now within the UK. Banks closing down branches, particularly those in sort of rural areas where there's less throughput. And I think you're seeing, obviously, that being driven by an attempt to reduce costs. But also, I think you have the element there around the increased costs of providing services to the higher level of resilience required under the operational resilience regime. So you have the closure of branches, but of course, that potentially causes foreseeable harm to consumers who rely on these branches. And I think, we all recognize that banking has become increasingly digital. A lot of people now never even go into the local branch, but there are certain people, and I think I would argue that often vulnerable customers, who actually have a high reliance on their local branch. They will go there to withdraw cash, to make deposits, and what have you. Maybe they're not as digitally savvy in terms of using internet banking and what have you. So again, you have a case there where you have this tension, closing the branches potentially because of the costs of providing it to that level of resilience causes foreseeable harm to certainly a subsection of consumers. And I think even we've seen the regulators wrestling with this tension. So you've seen talk about, banks will need to get permission from the regulator before they go ahead with branch closures and what have you. So I think there's a recognition even at the regulatory level of the tension between these two different things. I think another really is kind of topical example is the whole issue about access to cash. And again, this is a service that's been gradually being withdrawn, in part at least because of the cost of providing that service to the level of resilience required. Certainly, we've seen with some of our clients who are now looking to stop providing that as a service, the access to cash. And again, that causes arguably foreseeable harm to customers. And, we talk about it at the end today, the recent issues, the technical issues that caused this meltdown on Friday. But again, that just illustrates the importance of having different options, different channels, including, of course, having access to cash if you're no longer able to access your bank accounts. So again, that's another example. I think probably something else to mention. So these are almost kind of strategic decisions that have this tension between operational resilience on the one hand and providing services to this higher level of resilience required by the new rules versus consumer duty and avoiding causing a foreseeable harm. And these are kind of strategic decisions. I think another dimension to this, which probably hasn't been sufficiently considered, is that, of course, one of the key watchwords, and it's always the thing that's mentioned by regulators when talking about operational resilience, is this whole issue about having the plan Bs. So you have a disruption is inevitable. What is your plan B workaround to continue providing that service? And it may well be that when you're considering the plan Bs to avoid causing intolerable harm, you may actually have a knock-on impact that causes foreseeable harm to other consumers, or indeed to the consumers that you're providing the service to, and avoiding intolerable harm. So again, you have this tension. And I think the key point is that this needs to be recognized and it needs to be managed. So it's really important that when decisions are being made on operational resilience, that you're paying full consideration to these other outcomes that you're looking for on consumer duty and avoiding foreseeable harm. And obviously, if you're taking a decision to avoid intolerable harm that will cause foreseeable harm, making sure that that is properly considered through governance, and that it's well documented so that that can be defended when inevitably regulators ask questions about this harm that's been caused.
And I think when you just listening to the answer you both provided, the connection point is what decision do you make depending on the situation you're in, right? It seems to be the common thread here. It's all about decision making ultimately.
Absolutely.
And so you can have all the frameworks you want with a very nifty risk appetite, intolerance frameworks, etc. Ultimately, it's what you do with it that will be the judge, practically. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And in a crisis as well, you're making decisions quickly. So the importance of having good planning in place and having good governance arrangements in place that allows you to make those decisions, considering the various different things that need to be considered, including this issue of foreseeable harm, is going to be key, I think.
And as I was listening to you, and Andrew, I don't know if you have any other example you'd like to share with the audience, because here it's pretty much retail banking centric, but I think we have people from asset management, investment banking, and other sectors as well on the call. I can think about at least two on my side. One is around the use of mobile apps as a trigger, because not everybody has a mobile phone, never mind a smartphone. And that trend, in my view, is creating more and more exclusion as a result. In fact, it's almost impossible nowadays to conduct a transaction if you don't have a mobile app. So it's one. And the other one is around removing product in general. And we can talk a little bit about that in more details. Andrew, do you have any other example you'd like to share, or shall we just move on to the next question?
No, I think you've certainly touched on something which is very close to my heart, and it's that when we work with our customers, we often focus on the plan B. Often it's a technological solution, but not everybody has access to apps. There is quite clearly a proportion of the population who still aren't computer literate. My father, for example, was hugely proud of the fact that he had never turned on a computer in his life. In the end, we bought him a mobile phone. It was a very basic one. It's all he wanted. And even then, he used to turn it off to save the battery. So if there was, for example, a disruption at his local branch, that meant he had no alternatives. And so I think one of the things that when we're looking at how operational resilience and consumer duty overlap, for me, one of the big initial areas of focus should actually be, our vulnerable customers. And so I think that's key.
I think one thing just to add on the point you made, Julien, about exclusion, and I think this is a really important point, is just around the fact that, delivering these higher levels of resilience in the services you're providing doesn't come cost-free. So this is potentially expensive to add in things like, extra capacity, redundancy, having extra backups and what have you. And these additional costs are going to be passed on in terms of higher prices. So again, you have this potential impact on exclusion. So you may well find that customers may be excluded from being able to afford an increasing number of services that banks are offering, which again is bad news for customers. You can make the case, well, is it better for them to have a less resilient service or to not have a service at all? And I think this again is the tension, and I'm sure it's something that regulators are wrestling with as well.
Which makes me think we haven't touched on that on the white paper, but there's also the regulation on value for money that comes in then as that point. Because that is very clearly conflicting from an operational resilience and that piece of regulation. And having seen that in asset management, I think the asset management folks on this call should probably really think carefully about that, around how the increase in cost-to-income ratio rising from operational resilience could trigger a number of the funds and product being not viable from a value for money perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's a good segue into the next topic. So, Andrew, I'll come back to you in terms of approach to end-to-end organizational and product and service design. What should people pay attention to on that front?
So it's interesting because it's a point that Jimmy made, which is this: the first thing is to recognize the tension and break down these silos. certainly our clients, and it's my experience when I talk to other firms, is that consumer duty is being implemented in a totally different silo from op resilience management. I think once you recognize the potential tension, you need to ensure that those two functions are working closer together. When I was thinking about this before we started, I put down integrated consumer duty and op resilience management. That may be quite a big step for some firms, but certainly have them working closely together, have everything going through. Ultimately, I guess it's the chief operating officer that would have overall responsibility. But it's not just recognizing that tension, but restructuring in order to ensure that they're working closely together, and that they even understand. My sad guess is that there will be a lot of people working on consumer duty and a lot of people working on operational resilience, which is one of the reasons we wanted to raise this issue. I think there'll be a lot of people working on those two that have no idea how they're impacted by the other risk silo. And so I think for operational resilience, so operational resilience is kind of customer agnostic. It's what's your important business service. And so I think what you need to do in the operational resilience space is to ensure you've got sufficient focus on retail customers and where they're impacted. And Jimmy talked about plan Bs and plan Cs. And I think when you're thinking of those in operational resilience, don't just think of them from a resilience perspective, but take in, what does this mean for my retail customers? When you're faced with an operational resilience event, and this is one of the lovely things that's probably easier to say than easier to do, but if you have a choice of things that you can restore, then perhaps you prioritize the operational resilience elements that have disrupted, that have impacted consumer duty. So, for example, if you've got a number of outages, and one might be your app, then at least get your app up and running, even if just as a means of explaining to people what's going on within the organization. So think about whether you can prioritize restoring those CD, consumer duty elements. And the other thing, which I have to say I'm guilty of myself, so I was rather embarrassed to write this down yesterday, but when you're doing scenario exercises, then there should be that extra question, what's the impact on consumer duty? And it's certainly a learning I'll take away from this, so that's something that we can take into account when we're talking about operational resilience in our scenario workshops, so that we can understand our impact. When we set our impact tolerance, is that sufficient benchmark? Do we need in this particular scenario to be doing a little bit more? And the other thing is to integrate or work closely together the management information components for op resilience and consumer duty, because certainly at the moment they are, from the firms I've seen, they're independently developed. Each is a silo reporting to the board or board risk committee. So you need to draw those two together as well. They were the main issues that I came up with. I don't know, Julien or Jimmy, if you've got anything to add.
I think perhaps a couple of observations. One, and I think we talked about it when we wrote the paper, and it kind of alluded to that. Operational resilience is by itself is about operations, right, and technology, while consumer duty is actually about compliance. And as a result, it tends to be, as you mentioned, managed in two different places of the organization and not really thought through as an holistic way. And the other thing we already alluded to as well in that discussion is it's not only about these two regulations. You have value for money, you have essential, you have other aspects that needs to come together. And I think people on this call need to be mindful of the way they structure themselves to get to compliance with each of them, and really think about how they need to come back together. Because hopefully by now it's clear for people listening, they have to come together, otherwise you're going to take conflicting decisions. So that would be one thought I have on the back of what you just said, Andrew. Jimmy, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, not really. I think on the next section, I'll talk a bit more about this need for an integrated approach and having things joined up.
So, and precisely that, right?
So Julien said at the start that we would inevitably talk a little bit about SMCR, inevitable topic for every presentation in the regulatory space. What we've seen, interestingly, on operational resilience is the regulators actually quite unusually specified that it should be the COO or SMF24, if a firm had one, who was responsible for the implementation and reporting on operational resilience. I think what we've seen in practice is that at most firms, it's been the operations function that has tended to do most of it, including developing the policy and the framework and what have you. Obviously, there are issues there, which we may touch on later from a kind of a 3 lines perspective, and having that proper segregation between the people doing the homework and the people marking it. But what we've seen conversely on the consumer duty side is that this has tended to be run out of a compliance, as a regulatory change that is more in the comfort zone of compliance functions. So again, you have this potential challenge in terms of the coordination, the two things being managed probably appropriately in different areas of the firm. But clearly that needs to be managed in terms of having good communication. And I think having that good governance arrangements where you have the right people who can talk on these 2 different dimensions of harm at the appropriate governance fora. And obviously good communications is going to be key in that. One thing just to maybe finally add on this is that I think we've seen over the years a lot of concern from both from risk professionals, but also from regulators, that operational risk management and non-financial risk management has become incredibly fragmented. So we saw, particularly post the global financial crisis, the advent of conduct, and we've had cyber, third-party risk management, all these different silos of non-financial risk management, which have become almost kind of hot topics in themselves. And a lot of firms went off and set up, new functions to help manage these different things. And over time, you've had this fragmentation in non-financial risk management. I think one of the aspirations and one of the hopes of regulators in introducing the new rules on operational resilience is that actually this, because you're having to look horizontally across the firm, take this business service lens towards everything, that it is going to demand having much more of an integrated approach across non-financial risk management. Key things for delivering operational resilience are going to include, third-party risk management. Indeed, in the UK, regulators publish their new proposals on, or their new rules on third-party risk management at the same time as on operational resilience. And they said, you need to look at these together, because vulnerabilities from your third parties and your fourth parties are going to be a key aspect that could threaten your resilience. But third-party risk management, business continuity management, all these different aspects are going to be key to delivering on operational resilience. So I think what we've seen in some firms is the advent of this so-called umbrella type of a function for non-financial risk management, where you have the operational risk function looking across, providing this overarching holistic overview across all the different silos of non-financial risk management. And I think this is a classic example where if you have that umbrella type of approach, where you have the operational risk function providing that oversight, it's much easier then to have an integrated approach between things that actually manage in different parts of the firm, but actually need to be joined up in terms of their implications. And I think consumer duty, operational resilience, classic examples where having this umbrella approach can help you manage them more effectively.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Actually, I just noted that Elena asked a question. So, and I think, Andrew, it's coming back to the initial discussion point around definition of foreseeable versus intolerable harm. So the question is, do you believe there is a role for regulators to draw attention to these two terms and provide further information or clarification of how they should interact and intersect?
I certainly think it would be very helpful if the regulator did that. I don't want to speculate here whether the regulator was even aware of the difference when they were producing the rules and regulations. I've been an ex-regulator producing rules and regulations, and I know that people don't always talk to the right people. But the reality is that we do have this potential conflict. And so I think it would be very helpful if the regulator could explain how you deal with foreseeable harm in an operational resilience perspective, because I think it's a huge question out there. So yeah, I would certainly welcome the regulator doing that.
Jimmy, any view on that?
Oh, I agree. Whether it will happen is another question, but it would certainly be very helpful.
But I think, Andrew, the view you presented with that slide, which positioned very clearly foreseeable versus intolerable harm, also make the clear point, in my view, that people need to move the threshold. And the threshold for decision is actually earlier than what the organization might have thought as a result.
And I think that's the implication of that slide. So maybe you set up this tolerance for disruption. Tolerance for disruption will be outside of your risk appetite. We were doing some work with a Canadian bank, and OSFI regulations make it very clear that tolerance for disruption is outside of your risk appetite. But the issue is that, and Jimmy already talked about the cost of investment for operational resilience. If you're now investing to avoid causing foreseeable harm, then actually you're going to have to increase the amount of investment that you're making. So I think that's the challenge if you adopt that approach.
And Andrew, do you have anything else to add to what Jimmy mentioned around that intersection with SMCR?
Just one thing, and it's a thing that annoys me. And so people that know me will know I get these silly little things that annoy me. And it's the role of the consumer duty champion. One of the fascinating things about operational resilience and consumer duty, and it's one of the things I welcome, is that the regulators are now making specific individuals accountable in an organization. So I just want to ask the question, what is the role of a consumer duty champion? And the answer is, it's to support the chair and CEO in raising consumer duty in all relevant discussions. So that doesn't mean he's the only member of the board that has that accountability. The chair and the CEO also have a role in raising consumer duty. And I think that's one of the pitfalls we've seen a number of firms falling into. So, here's something in support of the poor consumer duty champion, but he's not the only person that has that responsibility. And so I do wonder, when you're drafting roles and responsibilities under SMCR, I would like to see firms including that under the chair and the CEO under their accountabilities as well. It's not just the consumer duty champion's role. So thanks for that opportunity.
No, I think I will add also, I'm talking from experience, and some former colleagues of mine are on this call today. I know some of them registered. There might have been some changes in the implementation of SMCR itself and SMS24 as well, which might exacerbate some of the point we're talking about. And the good example is how many SMS24 do you have in your organization? How do you divide up between more the ops space, the technology space, and how do you bring that back together in context and with connecting from a consumer duty perspective? The more of this whole split, clearly the blurry the lines become, and it's difficult to ascertain who is responsible for what and where the decision to be made. So for me, that's probably one thing I have in mind based on experience organization we need to think about. So the implementation of SMCR in that context, the way to say what I said is, might have an impact on the rest practically. Do you guys have a view on that? Do you have any experience around how the implementation of SMCR might exacerbate some of the things we talked about today?
I didn't hear you very well, I'm afraid. But so I'll maybe go off a tangent for which I apologise. But one of the things that's interesting about implementing operational resilience is that the regulator gave the SMF24 responsibility for implementing and reporting operational resilience. What happened in a lot of organisations, and I'm not criticising it, I would have done exactly the same thing, faced with implementing it, and there wasn't a policy or a framework, the SMF24 sat down, took a pragmatic approach, produced the policy and produced the framework. And so I certainly think from the senior management regime, there's a role for the chief risk officer in doing that. I'm conscious I probably haven't answered your question, Julien, because I didn't catch it. But
I think just one comment on that. I think again, you have this tension and this trade-off. So what we saw kind of in the global financial crisis was that, if everyone is accountable, then no one is, which was a problem. And then you almost move to the opposite position, which is you name one particular individual, say the consumer duty champion, and then everyone else thinks, well, they are responsible, therefore I don't need to think about it. So you almost need to try and get to a middle path between these two extremes. And I think that's something that firms need to manage. And I think there's a big cultural dimension to that. In other words, even if you have someone nominated as the consumer duty champion, that doesn't mean that me, say, as another senior executive or another board member can just say, I'm absolved of accountability for that just because his neck happens to be on the regulatory block as the kind of the appointed champion. Also, I need to take a responsibility for that as well. And again, I mentioned culture. I think culture is key for that. So that you do have this almost kind of, you balance up. So you have kind of formal accountability with an individual, but everyone takes collective accountability for actually delivering the right outcomes.
And that was done, wasn't it? Didn't they add an additional conduct rule, which was that you had to act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers? And I wonder how many people that are now captured by that rule appreciate the implications of it. I think that's be an interesting challenge if you were speaking to those that were captured, if they really understood what that meant.
And I think here we're going to continue and building a little bit on previous point Jimmy mentioned around the integration under NFR and the need to have an holistic approach to risk management. Keep clicking on the wrong button. So firstly, as Jimmy mentioned, having an holistic approach, looking across all aspects of risk management here is critical. Otherwise, you're going to fall exactly into the traps we talked about around you're going to make a decision that works for one, but conflict with the other. And so it means that whether it's decision-making, governance and oversight, and also risk management need to be looked at holistically. The challenge from experience you might face is around how you divided up the roles and responsibilities across risk, compliance, ops, perhaps technology, as I mentioned before, and never mind the role at board level with the consumer duty champion. And risk in that context must absolutely be managed holistically in agreement also with the SMCR, and the framework that sits behind must not be op resilience framework versus consumer duty framework versus something else, a conflict of interest. They may be looked at in integrated fashion. So it's a challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations which do not operate necessarily in that way. And that also based on around Jimmy's comment around what is the role of non-financial risk in general in all of that, in bringing all of those aspects together without creating, I would call, a monster with assessment and framework all over the place, which is already plenty in many organizations, way too many in my view, and make it manageable. So for me, it's about integrated risk management. That would be one. Unified risk assessment. Andrew mentioned scenario testing. For me, the scenario must be holistic. In the same way, when we did prudential scenario testing for ICAP, for example, or ILAP they looked at a lot of aspects. They need to capture the same thing here. Cross-functional risk committees, I will move away from op resilience versus consumer duty versus whatever else. You might need to have some specialized aspect to, say, manage third-party risk, for example. Fine, because that's very specialized. But at some point, it needs to come back together and provide that joined-up view that will enable you to understand where you are and what decision you need to make. And the decision, in my view, should be made at that level, not necessarily lower down. Otherwise, you might lose that connection point. The other thing is around accountability framework. And again, here you're going to find some of those aspects in the paper. We discussed quite a fair bit about SMCR, which is about accountability. Make sure that decision-making and accountability in that context are joined up. And if you need to review the role of the SMF24, how they provide the reasonable steps and the governance sitting behind, do so. Because if you don't, you're again going to take the wrong decision without realizing it until it comes back to bite you. We talked about culture. Culture is paramount in that context. Again, culture of accountability, integrity, but also customer focus is critical here. And unfortunately, we talk a lot about retail customer here, which I appreciate under operation resilience might create some conflict with the role from a market stability standpoint. And I'll be curious to see in that context, and we probably are going to have a little bit of time to talk about the last point. How do organizations manage that consumer duty, vulnerable customer and market stability aspect in terms of service recovery? Because here you could have a very clear conflict between the two. Another aspect and last aspect I would cover for that in terms of holistic risk management, it's about how do you allocate resources across all of that. Again, for the same reason, you might go one way, go in the other way. But in the end, all organizations, all of you have limited resources. It's a finite number. So there's so much you can do. And I would say, what is the biggest bang for your bucks, right? So what is the biggest impact you could have? Some of it might be actually to simplify the risk framework you have in place and integrate them to ensure that you stop demultiplying the ask across your operational team and joined up the issues and decisions you need to make as well. So just a thought on that. Andrew, Jimmy, any additional things you would want to add in terms of holistic risk management and governance?
For me, it's just emphasizing this joining up. Jimmy talked about the op risk umbrella, but it's making sure that everything is fully integrated. I think that has to be the key for me.
I mean, it's a bit of an old cliche when we talk about operational risk management being about, the art of common sense. But again, a lot of it is, and having this joined up approach and having just basic good communication between different functions and between different senior heads within an organization is going to be key. Because I think all of us have worked in large organizations where often that doesn't happen. So just putting in the mechanisms that allow that to happen and to have those conversations absolutely is key to delivering on this outcome, rather than, as Julien said, creating yet more frameworks and tools and making things even more complex and difficult to manage.
You're going to find to that point, by the way, in the paper, I couldn't stop myself, so I apologize in advance, that I talk about incident management, because for me, it's a typical example where, in my experience, there are way too many of these frameworks floating around, and that creates a lot of problems. And the bigger you are, the more problems you're going to have. If you have one for compliance, one for tech, one for risk, multiple for audit, and multiple for compliance, which I've seen many, many times, that can only lead to more problems for you. So really think about that simplification piece. Never mind, it's going to be good for your cost base. So that could be a win-win situation, even though I appreciate it might not be easy to address. With that, we still have 10 minutes. I'd like to take a bit of a break to see if anyone has any questions. So we had one from Elena. I don't know if anyone is still on the call, by the way, because I can only see a couple of people on the live stream, but any question from the audience? So I'll use the comment box for that purpose. I'm giving 1 or 2 more seconds, and then we can move on to the next point. And then if people have questions, we can keep them from get them from the feed. So let's move on to the last point. Clearly, we couldn't talk about operational resilience and that topic today, going back to what happened on Friday, the CrowdStrike outage. So I'm going to take you guys a little bit put you on a little bit on the spot. Andrew, any views around what organizations should be doing there, or should have done and perhaps didn't do?
I did take the advantage before this call started to try and get some insight from Julien, because it seems to me this is obviously right in the third party risk management space, and the issue that isn't particularly clear to me is where CrowdStrike sits in relationship to whoever's purchasing their service, and it may be that the service you're actually purchasing is the Microsoft, and so your relationship is with Microsoft, and CrowdStrike are one of many people that are involved in your receipt of the end product. And for me, this just highlights, when we do training, we talk about the importance of understanding your fourth and nth counterparties. But when you look at someone like Microsoft, if you drew that spidergram, and I'm sure I've seen one in the last few days, there's a lot of fourth, fifth, sixth parties involved in that process. And so I think two things. One is it shows how extremely difficult it is to understand everybody that's behind your third party. And the other, what it outlines to me, is the difficulty of managing resilience for cloud providers, because it's a huge investment. No firms are going to go and have a substitute so as they can just switch over to one of the other providers. So I think the outage was a big wake-up call in terms of its global impact, and the difficulties that firms have in understanding their exposure to these various parties. But I'm still kind of struggling to try and come to terms with the detail. So Jimmy, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
And I think as well, the other dimension to this, which is slightly ironic, is that we all know from many surveys that have been done that it's the biggest cyber vulnerability is around not patching software, so not putting in the updates. And we saw a few years ago, I remember, the FCA did some really good research and did a survey, and they came out with the findings that showed that most cyber incidents, most IT disruptions were due to this very simple thing of not updating software with the latest patch. And this is a case where it seems that actually attempting to manage that vulnerability ended up with an errant update causing this huge problem. So I mean, I guess we don't quite fully know the cause of it yet, but it sounds like from the initial commentary that this was potentially just a human error. And again, it shows that actually the source of most operational risk incidents is at the end of the day human error, people making mistakes or doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And I think again, we often lose sight of the basics, so of managing people and making sure that they don't make errors, particularly as things shift more and more to reliance on technology. We forget that actually people have a key role, and people making errors is going to be a key source of operational risk. But it's going to be fascinating to see how this develops over time as we learn more about this as a real kind of case study, as the biggest IT disruption in history. It's been a quiet week on the news front, hasn't it? All in all.
Well, I suspect some people on this call are still recovering from it. So,
indeed.
In my view, and just to add to what the two of you have said, the first observation I will have is I heard too many times organizations saying it's not going to happen. Well, hopefully that should be, as Andrew said, a wake-up call. When you do scenario testing, you can push a bit more in the extreme, right? Because here the entire world got impacted. And it was actually potentially not a cyber attack, by the way. It was, as Jimmy said, perhaps a human error. So here you go. And I'm seeing too many organizations nowadays saying, all right, we are not going to test AWS because too big to fail. I'm like, well, here we go. So that's the first thing. The second thing is preparation. There's no such thing as no crisis going to happen. You are going to be hit by a crisis, and so you need to think about how you're going to prepare for that, and in that example, full service and product disruption. And especially if it's triggered by, in that context, a fourth, fifth, whatever party, what is your response to that? And that connect directly to the discussion we had today. And that you can't improvise. It has to be prepared in advance. Andrew?
An interesting dimension on this, and I knew I'd seen it somewhere this morning, and it's on the front page of the Telegraph, and it's potential unintended consequences from regulation. And I'll just read what's on the front page of the Telegraph. Microsoft has blamed EU rules for enabling a faulty security package to cause the IT outage. The software giant said an agreement with the EU meant it was unable to make security changes that would have blocked the CrowdStrike update. So maybe there's that issue there as well, kind of unintended regulatory consequences maybe lurking in the background somewhere.
I think the other thing that this is really going to throw up in the air is those discussions within the operational resilience scenario testing workshops, where you say, okay, we have this dependency, let's say on our cloud provider. So we have the Microsoft cloud, we dependent on that, but we assume because they are, huge company that they will be incredibly resilient. So we don't have to, in that case, have a plan B. I think there are going to be some interesting questions around that going forward. I think both that and other areas where probably there's been maybe an acceptance that there is a dependence, that there is a vulnerability without a plan B. So really challenging and questioning whether that is something that is prudent and within your risk appetite.
And of course, the definition of severe but plausible for a cloud provider has moved now, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of things, and perhaps we can on the chat, so we can close and conclude the call on that. One is, I think, a comment from Ben. It's very difficult to anticipate issues or to influence actions with firms like Microsoft, and sometimes you might not even have a relationship with them. So, yeah, fair point, and that's not applied only to Microsoft, but you will have AWS and many others that will be in the same situation. And I think we're going to conclude on one good question that clearly, how do you do if you don't have the money to actually invest? What would be perhaps one or two recommendations you can have each? Andrew, I'll start with you.
On money to invest for operational.
So what can firms do if they don't have funds available for significant investment in that context of what we just talked about today?
I think you have a real issue because if you're unlucky, you're going to end up in conflict with the regulator. And I guess that the next step of that is you might not have the funds, but what if the outcome of failing of causing foreseeable harm or intolerable harm, what if the outcome of that was a Section 166 skilled persons report? They cost a lot of money. What if the outcome was a regulatory fine? What if the outcome was an increase in your capital requirement? So I think if you're looking at the cost of these things, you have to also take into account the costs of getting them wrong. And that would be my piece of advice. So don't just say, we can't afford this expenditure. If you're going to take that decision, you have to be fully aware of the consequences. Jimmy, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Well, I just add that I think culture and mindset doesn't require a huge amount of investment. So having that thought process that you're thinking about that potential tension and that you're having effective communication is going to be key, and it doesn't cost anything. Maybe it's just the price of a coffee in the canteen with the relevant person.
I I will simply conclude that it's a trade-off, as Andrew said, what's the alternative of doing nothing? So your cost benefit is not only the investment, but it's the actual alternative of doing nothing. On that note, I think we're 1 minute over, so I'd like to thank the two of you for this very insightful discussion. Hopefully it was useful for the audience. And I would like to thank you all for joining this call today. Again, I would love to have your feedback, so I might send a survey on the back of this call just to get feedback on what went well and where we could improve. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are, and hopefully speak to you soon. Bye.
Thanks very
Bye-bye.
much. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.